name is Routt. I'm the president of the board of directors of the Fair Housing Center. And on behalf of the staff and board, it's my real pleasure to thank you for coming to our third annual Fair Housing Breakfast. And I have to say, personally, it's just so exciting to see this event grow each year, because not only does it mean that we're bringing in more money and we can further the work of the Fair Housing Center, but it also increases the number of people and the organizations and the groups that are represented here today who will leave and hopefully continue the conversation about what each of us can also do to further fair housing. So I'd like to take this moment to thank our sponsors who really help ensure that this event can happen each year. So I'd like to thank our gold sponsor, McKinley, our silver sponsors, PNC Bank, and the Washtenaw County Office of Community and Economic Development, and our many bronze sponsors, the Ann Arbor State Bank, the Bank of Ann Arbor, the Charles Reinhardt Company, Comerica Bank, Fifth Third Bank, Flagstar Bank, Huron Valley Financial, Highland Michigan Insurance Company, Key Bank, the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, the Michigan Realtors, Old National Bank, and Zingerman's Community of Businesses. So we should say thank you. Now I get to introduce our wonderful director, Pam Kisch. Long-term has seen this organization through thin and through really difficult times and has just maintained us and allowed this organization to grow. So please join me in welcoming and thanking Pam Kisch.
Good morning. Good morning. We can hardly believe our good fortune when Theodore M. Shaw, a pioneer in civil rights law, agreed to be the speaker for our 2016 Fair Housing Breakfast. Professor Shaw is the Julius L. Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law and the Director of the Center for Civil Rights at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Before joining the UNC Law School, Professor Shaw taught at his alma mater, Columbia School of Law. But he hasn't always been in academia. Professor Shaw was the 5th Director, Counsel, and President of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, for which he worked in several capacities over a 26-year period. As many of you know, the founder of the Legal Defense Fund and its first Director Counsel was Justice Thurgood Marshall. In 1990, Professor Shaw left the Legal Defense Fund to join the faculty at the University of Michigan Law School here in Ann Arbor, where some of us had the pleasure of working with him. While at Michigan, he played a key role in drafting the admissions policy that was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in the affirmative action case Grutter v. Bollinger. In addition to education, Professor Shaw has litigated employment, voting rights, housing, police misconduct, capital punishment, and other civil rights cases in trial and appellate courts and in the U.S. Supreme Court. Given his vast legal experience, we should all be intrigued by the title of his talk today, The Sleeping Giant of Civil Rights, the Fair Housing Act. Please help me to welcome former FHC board member, Theodore M. Shaw.
Thank you, Pam, for that introduction. I often have to say when I go to speak that with introductions, less is more. And I appreciate that. You get kind of tired of hearing about yourself after thought when I was leaving Ann Arbor in 1993, I got pulled back to the Legal Defense Fund as the deputy director, associate director counsel, the position is called. And I took a leave thinking I'd get back here, and it never happened. Some people had the foresight to say to me, "You won't be back," and I said, "Oh, yes, I will." So I'm back. And I'm happy to be here. This is an organization that I value tremendously. The work that the organization does is important work, and it's evidenced by the fact that all of you have gotten up this, I started to say chilly morning. It's chilly for me, but you all just take this as Friday. It's a good morning. I spoke with, I see Ruth looking at me, and she gave me a missive. She said, say something good, you know. Give us some good news. The good news is, I think, that at 11 o'clock this morning, we'll know who President Obama's Supreme Court nominee is going to be. I hope that isn't as good as it gets. I say that because we know how obstructionist, a certain party is and what they've pledged to do. But you got to go ahead and fight and see where the chips fall. I'm hoping that this is a good day. Let me start by saying that I came out of law school. I'm looking around the room to kind of judge who's here. I think I can be comfortable saying this. If I say this in front of my law students now, they look at me as if I'm Jurassic. But I came out of law school in 1979. I had an afro that would blot out the sun at the time. I was thinner. It was a different time. And right out of law school, I went to the Justice Department, the Civil Rights Division. The first case I was assigned to was a case against the largest suburb of Cleveland. Anybody here from the Cleveland area? Okay, I didn't know that. The defendant was the city of Parma. Parma, for people who have lived in the Cleveland area, needs no introduction. It had a reputation on the west side, across the river, and it had a reputation as being a place that was not inclusive. And in fact, the city in the early 1970s was known for some statements that either the mayor or the city council made. I remember his name, I won't call it, about some low-income housing that was proposed for the city. The city was willing to take senior housing, but did not want to take family-subsidized housing because the city equated family-subsidized housing with African Americans. And the mayor was pretty upfront in the city council meeting. He said, "We don't want Negroes in Parma." That's the kind of evidence, by the way, that once you've sued, you love. I say the worse the better. And it's not the kind of statement you hear much of these days when you see decisions made to exclude people by deciding not to allow certain kind of housing. So the government, the U.S. government, sued the city of Parma, and I ended up being assigned to that case. I was low person on the totem pole because I had just started. But it was a great experience, and they gave me experience in the case as soon as I was able to conduct depositions, or actually not depositions, but actually testimony. It was a great experience for a young lawyer coming right out of law school. But it was also, for me, something that was near and dear to my heart in some ways. Because I didn't only know something about subsidized housing, but I grew up in a public housing project in the Bronx. And so low-income housing was something I knew. And I had watched as the neighborhood I grew up in, the public housing project that I grew up in, which had been built and opened with the intent of maintaining some degree of racial integration. I watched as that community changed, and it changed very rapidly. It changed because the demographics of the Bronx changed very rapidly. If anybody here is familiar with the Bronx, you know that in the 1960s, there was a huge development built called Co-op City in the North Bronx. I sometimes use it, I see at least one person nodding her head, but I sometimes use that development and its history to kind of test who really knows the Bronx, because it was built on the site of an amusement park in the Bronx. You remember it? Freedom Land, it was called. Yes, it was. And many of the white people who were in the public housing project that I grew up in moved to Co-op City. Others moved out to Long Island. And as the city screened the new applicants, their patterns of screening changed. The housing police began to conduct themselves in a different way. They no longer insisted on ticketing people for minor violations, but quality of life violations. But most troublesome was the advent of drugs and their introduction into our community, and quite frankly, the way that the police began to either turn their backs, and frankly, some of them did more than turn their backs. They put their hands into the till. And that's a heavy charge. But I know it. So I knew something about low-income housing when I went to the Justice Department. I had some views about it. And so I understood how low-income housing was viewed in many communities that did not have significant numbers of African Americans. I also understood how demographic patterns could change. I understood, and I came to understand, how communities came to look the way they did more deeply as I litigated Parma and subsequently other housing cases. You know, I've come to say, and I don't need to explain this in this group, I've come to say that racially segregated communities don't look the way they did or do serendipitously or accidentally. That racially segregated communities look the way they do as a consequence of years and years and decades of decisions made on the local, state, and federal level by governmental actors that interact with the actions of private actors to create the patterns that we see today. Most people take all of that for granted as they drive either past, usually past, sometimes through, communities that are heavily black and brown and are poor communities like the one that I grew up in. They assume that they look that way as a consequence of choice. Those who resemble usually assemble. That may have only the slightest bit of truth in it. It may be choice, but it's constrained choice.